Howdy, everybody. We're going to continue on with our types of statements lecture. This will be the second part of it. This will be fairly quick, actually. We're mostly going to just look at some common statements that pop up all the time. And let's, just like we always do, let's go ahead and jump right in. So remember the conditional statement. We've talked about this. I said I wouldn't use that word conditional very much. This is just the if-then. So this is that if A, then B. And if I say that in a sentence, then there you go. So what a lot of people do actually, and they do this incorrectly, is when they say if A, then B, they'll also think that it works if you flip it around. So if I say like, if it's Wednesday, then the sky is blue, right? So that a lot of people will flip it and they'll say, okay, well then if the sky is blue, then it must be Wednesday. And that's a great example of, you're like, wait a minute, no, if the sky's blue, that doesn't mean that it's a Wednesday. It could be another day in the week, right? And so a lot of people flip that incorrectly. Sometimes it's hard to tell whether or not it works. So in that example that I just gave, that's actually what we call the converse. So let's go ahead and get into this. If I give you the conditional and I give you a statement that's that if A, then B, then we have names for variations of this compound statement. You know, you might start off with this compound statement, if A, then B. But if you decide instead to flip things around and say, you know, verbally, if B, then A, we call that the converse. And that's just a different name for it. In a sentence format, I've got it written right there, if B, then A. Great. If I decide, instead of saying the conditional, if A, then B, in that blue, if instead I decide to say, if not A, then not B, we call that the inverse. And then lastly, we saw this at the very end last time, we've got the contrapositive. If not B, then not A. And so what we're doing in each of these is we're basically just taking this baseline statement, the conditional, and we're just kind of flipping it around and we're negating things and we're changing it. But when we do that, with the conditional in particular, we like to give them some names: converse, inverse, contrapositive. These are names that you're going to need to know. I'll ask you, I'll say, write down the converse of this statement, and you'll need to know what I mean when I say converse. So let's go ahead and look at some examples. I'm going to flip through these slides fairly quickly at first, and then I'll come back and loop around and go through them a little slower. If I have these statements, Tessa is a chocolate lab and Tessa is brown. That's my A and B. So if I say, hey, write down the conditional, you're going to say, if Tessa is a chocolate lab, then Tessa is brown. Boom. I don't really care whether or not Tessa is actually a chocolate lab or whether or not Tessa is even brown, but this is just the statement that is the conditional. Okay. If I tell you to write down the converse to that statement, then you're going to just flip it. You're going to, instead of doing A, then B, you're going to do B, then A. So you're going to say, hey, if Tessa is brown, then Tessa is a chocolate lab. And that's the converse of this conditional statement. Sort of like opposite. It's just like, hey, flip the order of things. If I told you to write down the inverse, you don't do any flipping of the order of the if-then statement, but you just put a not in front of everything. You negate the A and the B separately. So A is that Tessa is a chocolate lab, B is that Tessa is brown. But here I'm going to say, if Tessa is not a chocolate lab, then Tessa is not brown. And that's the inverse statement. Lastly, we have the contrapositive. I flip and I negate. So I'm swapping the order of the if-then and I'm putting negation symbols in front of both sides. So I would say, instead of saying Tessa is brown, I'll say, if Tessa is not brown, then Tessa is not a chocolate lab. And that's the contrapositive. I've flipped both and I've negated both. So let's come back here to this conditional statement. Now, we know that if a dog is a chocolate lab, then it's brown. That's why it's called a chocolate lab. It's not a white lab. It's not a black lab. It's not any of those. If it's a chocolate lab, then the color of it is brown. So this conditional is a true statement. If Tessa is a chocolate lab, then Tessa is in fact brown. We know that for sure. Now, let me be clear. I don't actually know this dog, Tessa. I don't actually know if Tessa is a chocolate lab or not. I don't know if Tessa is brown or not. But I do know that if Tessa happens to be a chocolate lab, then she will be brown. So again, I don't care about whether or not A and B are true or false. I sort of harp on that a lot, but it's important. I don't care about these statements and whether or not they're true. I just know that this statement here is true, right? So let's move on. So this statement is true. If Tessa is a chocolate lab, then she is definitely brown. Okay. So this is going to be true. Now, the converse, if Tessa is brown, then Tessa is a chocolate lab. Well, let's think about this. Can you think of a dog that is brown but not a chocolate lab? Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, one that comes to mind is a pit bull. A lot of pit bulls are brown. And so just because Tessa is brown, that doesn't necessarily mean that she's a chocolate lab. She could be another breed of dog. And so this is actually false. Moving on to the inverse. If Tessa is not a chocolate lab, then Tessa is not brown. So we're starting off, we're saying, okay, Tessa is not a chocolate lab. She's a golden retriever, or she's a pit bull, or she's a boxer, or some other type of dog. But I'm saying that because she's some other breed, then she can't be brown. Well, that doesn't work. And it kind of is the same thing as what we just did. She could be a pit bull, which is not a chocolate lab, but she could be brown because a lot of pit bulls are brown. So this is false as well. And lastly, we're going to get to the contrapositive. If Tessa is not brown, then she's not a chocolate lab. And while this might sound false, it actually is true. And because if Tessa were brown, then she would be, or excuse me, sorry, let me rephrase this. If Tessa is not brown, then Tessa is not a chocolate lab. Well, if Tessa is a chocolate lab, then she's brown. So if she's not brown, then she can't be a chocolate lab because all chocolate labs are brown. So if Tessa is pink, then she's definitely not a chocolate lab, right? And so this would actually be true. And what we're seeing here is that when this conditional is true, the contrapositive was also true. That was this last guy, the one we just did. And when the conditional was true, the inverse and the converse were false. Let me go ahead and write all this down just because I'm using a lot of big words there. So when the conditional equals true, the inverse, sorry, let's start with the converse, is false. The inverse is false. And the contrapositive is true. And this is always the case. This is just the nature of how the truth tables work out. You can do these truth tables out, and you could actually see that if you do the truth table for the conditional and the truth table for the contrapositive, they mean the exact same thing. We actually did that last time. Same thing goes for converse and inverse. They're not the same as the conditional, and so they'll be false. Now, we've done this example here where I've given you a conditional that is in fact true. I've used actual facts. I've used the fact that chocolate labs are always brown. But if I changed this, instead of saying brown and I said like pink or something like that, this statement down here in the box, that's not true anymore. If Tessa is a chocolate lab, then Tessa is pink. No, chocolate labs aren't pink. So this is actually a false statement. And so what I want to point out there is that if the conditional is actually false, then we have a whole different game here. Let me give myself some space. If the conditional is false, it turns out that the converse and the inverse are in fact both true statements, right? And what we're seeing here is that basically whatever the conditional is, we just flip it for the converse and the inverse. And the contrapositive is also the same as the conditional, so it would also be false. And that's sort of this, the name of the game here is just, hey, I've got a conditional and I've got a, contrapositive, which always takes the same truth value, and I've got converse and inverse, which takes the opposite truth value. So here's sort of another example type of problem that I could give you. I could give you a statement like this. Big ol' ugly complicated statement. And I could say, hey, write down the inverse. And you go, okay. So when I look at this, I see a whole section here. I'm going to call this smiley face. And I see a whole section here. I'm going to call that frowny face. So this statement is basically, well, it's a conditional, right? And I can kind of break it down just to smiley face and an if then with a frowny face, right? So if I ask you for the inverse, we remember on the inverse, we're going to negate both things. We're not going to do any flipping. We're just going to negate them. I just put some negations in front. And if I write this out, if I write this guy out fully without using my smiley faces and whatnot, it would be not A or B, and an if then with not A, if then B, right? Kind of ugly and complicated. That's fine. I don't really care about how complicated it is. You've taken the inverse though. You have found the inverse for me right there. And that's the type of question that I can ask you. I can say, hey, let's start off with your, with your conditional statement. You tell me the inverse. You tell me the converse. You tell me the contrapositive. And you can flip them and negate them appropriately. And there you go. And when I say appropriately, again, all I mean is just these sort of rules that we've seen here. These, conditional, converse, inverse, contrapositive. Flip and negate according to this column right here. And that's actually all that I've got on this second second part of the types of statements lecture. So that wraps that up. Next time we'll talk about logical arguments and how to carry on with those.